The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Donald Trump's moment of truth arrives days before Christmas. Welcome back to our Christmas edition of Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. The showdown over the shutdown, a roller coaster ride that ends with a partial government shutdown as President Trump, after apparently wavering, gets the House but not the Senate to pass a bill with funding for his border wall. We'll chronicle how this shutdown all came down and what might be next. Meanwhile, Michael Flynn continues to twist in the wind after a sentencing hearing marked by truly bizarre comments from the judge. Trump decides to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, prompting the resignation of Defense Secretary James Mattis effective in March. We'll talk all of that through. Plus, Dr. Stephen Cohen, leftist scholar on Russia, is back to discuss his book, War with Russia, ? In which he leaves the progressive reservation by trashing the left's cult-like narrative of a conspiracy between Trump and Vladimir Putin. Wow, of all the chaos that's been the order of every day since Donald Trump was elected president, the roller coaster ride that was this week's showdown over the shutdown has to top them all. Let's see if I can encapsulate the chain of events in a comprehensible way for you. President Trump, of course, ran on a platform that put a southern border wall at the top of his, to say the least, bold agenda. 23 months into his presidency, it may have been started in dribs and drabs, but the wall is nowhere near completion. And with Democrats set to take control of the House of Representatives in a couple of weeks, the president was faced with his last opportunity to secure funding for the wall from Congress. Trump's usual bravado was on display just last week in proclaiming in his Oval Office scrum with Senator Chuck Schumer and Representative Nancy Pelosi that he would be proud to shut down the government for the sake of border security. Now, the reality that cut through the fog of the swamp in all of this is that no issue better exemplifies the disconnect between the heartland, which elected Trump to build the wall, and the D.C. swamp, which has shown little or no interest in it, outside of the 36 members of the House Freedom Caucus and some other hardcore conservatives in the House and Senate. As his supporters were cheering on his apparent commitment to do whatever it took to get his $5 billion in funding for the wall, word started trickling down that Trump was softening. There were reports that he was being steamrolled by the Democrats and was rolling over. His supporters were furious. The phones were lighting up Thursday morning with angry callers on the Breitbart News radio show, which has backed Trump from the day he announced his candidacy. And one of Trump's most rabid supporters, drama queen Ann Coulter, who's made a living off of over-the-top reactions to almost everything, ripped into Trump and was ready to throw him overboard, calling Trump gutless, saying his presidency is a joke, and adding that he will leave no legacy whatsoever. Trump's response was to send out a tweet declaring that one way or the other we will win on the wall. Well, that was cold comfort for his supporters. But then mid-morning Thursday, the story began to change again, and the rolling drama continued to unfold. The White House sent out a press release saying the president was not happy with a continuing resolution passed by the Senate, which would keep the government open till February 8th, but provided not a single dollar of funding for border security. Now, that statement by the president gave his supporters some degree of hope. Then the president met with outgoing House Speaker Paul Ryan and other prominent Republicans at the White House, and Ryan emerged to say the president would not sign the bill passed by the Senate and told Ryan to go pass a bill in the House that gives him what he needs to sign it. About an hour later, a bill was introduced in the House that provided the $5 billion Trump requested for the wall. The House passed the bill by a surprisingly wide margin, 217 to 185. That's a 32-vote margin. And then sent it to the Senate, where 60 votes were required to avoid a Democrat filibuster, and that did not happen. So 9 agencies and about 25% of the federal government will suspend operations, and about 10% of federal government employees will be furloughed, sure to be paid when they return to the job. Now we start with the blame game. Trump, in his usual stream of consciousness that is at once refreshing and maddening, said last week he'd be proud to shut down the government for the sake of border security and take the blame for it, but then with the shutdown just hours away, he blamed the Democrats. But what really matters in all this is whether this shutdown is justified. Given the intransigence of Democrats intent on denying Trump his wall because they hate him more than they love having a more secure border, it's really an easy answer. But the posturing of both sides is far less important than the crux of an issue that's now come to a head. And maybe, just maybe, it will focus people's attention like a laser beam on what's at stake here. Yes, this was a moment of truth for Trump. The wall was the centerpiece of Trump's campaign, and if he backed down, he would likely suffer severe consequences among his base. But beyond the politics of it all and the usual Washington blame game, is this worth it for the country? Well, we shall see just how important the wall really is to the citizens of this country. That'll be reflected in polls sure to come shortly on whether Trump has done the right thing. But consider the fact of millions of illegal immigrants already in the midst of us breaking the law, somewhere between 10 and 20 million, estimates vary. Consider the exploding opioid epidemic that's exacerbated by drugs flowing across the border. Consider that hundreds of illegals try to cross the border every day. Consider the much ballyhooed caravan with thousands of impoverished Central Americans desperate to take advantage of our asylum laws and do whatever it takes to get here and stay here. And consider the volume of crimes illegals are committing in a country they're not even allowed to be in. You don't need statistics to know that all of these are serious problems that the politicians have refused to address until Trump came along. This is such a broad and deep problem that nobody short of someone willing to fall on the sword for the sake of repairing a deeply broken immigration system that's a national disgrace provides the chance to fix it. Congressman Mark Walker, a member of the House Freedom Caucus, probably put it best about the shutdown and the issue of border security. We'll play it for you later. And this is the view of most of the 62 million people who rolled the dice on Donald Trump 2 years ago. Walker said, "This is a hill worth dying on." Quick break, and then we'll return with a leftist scholar on Russia who's broken with his progressive compatriots in saying there was no conspiracy between Trump and Putin and that leftists pushing that narrative resemble a cult.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
From Russia without love. From the moment Donald Trump was elected president, stunned Democrats and leftists who were certain that Hillary Clinton would vanquish the bombastic billionaire looked for reasons why she lost an election she couldn't possibly lose. They all believed one thing in common: Trump could only have won the election by some illegal, underhanded means. And they immediately focused on Russia. And they've taken it to the limit with a nonstop refrain about a nefarious plot between Trump and Putin, and they even managed to get a special counsel named to investigate it. But there's a crack in the leftist armor. His name is Dr. Stephen Cohen, longtime respected leftist scholar on Russia and the Soviet Union, who's written a new book entitled War with Russia, ? We spoke with him in a wide-ranging interview, played you the first part last week, when he said he studied possible collusion in depth and found no evidence of it. So now we present the rest of the interview, which attracted a lot of readers on LibertyNation.com this week. Dr. Cohen said the indictments and convictions of former Trump associates, such as Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort, have nothing to do with collusion or even Russia.
When you look at the indictments, look at the two indictments. One is for lying to the FBI, which is I got you crime, right? That's the way they operate.
Or process crime, as they call it.
Process crime, correct. Or, and more prevalent maybe, are financial misdeeds. That is, people who should have registered as foreign agents for other countries did not. But I would bet you that there's 1,000 political operatives in Washington, Americans, who represent foreign governments who are not registered, though a lot of them ran off and got registered as soon as they saw these indictments. You probably read about that.
Yes,
so this is another thing that people have been doing for years. It's a very lucrative business. What Paul Manafort, who's going to prison, did, and they don't file, they get a lot of cash changes hands. They use foreign accounts. They don't pay their taxes fully. This is, it's bad, but it's jaywalking when we're talking about, wrongly, some kind of conspiracy between Trump and the Kremlin. So this little book, it's a kind of motion picture of this drama as it begins to unfold in 2014 and then culminates in Trump's election and these astonishing charges, unprecedented in American history, that a sitting American president is an agent of the Kremlin. There's no evidence for it, but it's exceedingly dangerous.
Our guest is Dr. Stephen Cohen, author of the new book, War with Russia, ? Now, Dr. Cohen, Trump put on something of an embarrassing performance at his summit with Putin in Helsinki, and he seems unwilling to criticize Putin publicly. But the president has also taken many actions that weren't good for Russia, competing against them for energy contracts in Europe, bombing Syria, condemning them for the poison gas attack in England, expelling Russian diplomats, slapping some sanctions on them. How would you describe the relationship between Trump and Putin as you perceive it?
Let me start at the end of the story. I was in Moscow 2 weeks ago, and it was very clear from the people I know who are not actually in the Kremlin, but very close to the Kremlin as advisors. And these are people who actually want a good Russian-American relationship. They're called pro-Western Russians. It's fairly clear that the Kremlin, Putin, the inner circle, is about at the point where they're going to give up completely on Trump. Why? Well, first of all, Trump has canceled 3 meetings with Putin. That's embarrassing. In diplomacy, it may be unprecedented. Why did Trump do that? From the moment Trump announced his candidacy, he said he thought cooperating with Russia is a good thing. Now, we used to call that détente. You know that word. And in the 20th century, it meant to introduce cooperation and reduce conflict in our relations with Russia. I always favored that. So though I didn't favor Trump as a presidential candidate, I favored that part of his program. And he's pretty much stuck to it. You got to hand it to him. So why didn't he go ahead? Why did he do the other things, which even Obama didn't do, harsh measures toward Russia? I think because he's got this Russiagate monkey on his back. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's got to show that he's tough, and he's not Putin's puppet, as people call him. Look what happened. What was it? I remember it was my birthday, November 25th, when the Ukrainians and the Russians had a naval conflict. You remember that a couple weeks ago?
I do.
Trump used that as a reason not to go and meet Putin in Argentina. They had a 2-hour meeting scheduled there. But think about it. If you're in a crisis situation with Russia, that's when you want to go and talk to the Russian leader. That's what other American presidents did. But the reverse happened with Trump because of the politics of Russiagate. He evidently felt that because of these accusations against him, he could not go see Putin in the aftermath of this conflict, even though, logically, the conflict is a reason why they should have met. So I see Trump as a man who, for whatever reasons, believes that a cooperative relationship with Russia would be good, and he's not the... I mean, Reagan was the great cooperator. He thought he had ended the Cold War. There's precedent in this. And by the way, it's associated with Republican presidents. Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan were the people who did this détente with Russia. Trump seems to want to do it, but he's being prevented from doing it. Now, you may say, well, he should be stronger. He should be more skillful. He should... But how is it to wake up every morning? And, I didn't vote for Trump. I'm not pro-Trump in that sense. But how do you think what it's like to wake up every morning and read in the papers and be told that you're a Kremlin agent? I mean, what's it like for his kids and his family and his wife? This is really unprecedented. That's what you've got to understand.
Now, you're working against the grain in progressive circles where you spent most of your career. You work with The Nation. You're a contributing editor. You've written for it for years. I'm curious about the reaction of your progressive friends at The Nation and elsewhere to your criticism of the left's narrative about Trump-Russia collusion.
Well, I mean, you probably know the answer. They don't like it. I wouldn't call them friends, but it is true that I sort of I haven't been politically active that much in my life, but I have lived on the so-called liberal, progressive, democratic reservation most of my life. What complicates it is that my wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, is the editor of The Nation. Mm-hmm. And she takes the flack, and that I particularly don't like. Well, think about it. In this age when everybody's supposed to be a feminist and women are independent from their husbands and their spouses, everybody blames her for what I write. I've been involved in these disputes about American-Russian relations for 40 years. There was always plenty of space in the media for both sides to have their say, always, in the 70s, the 80s, and on. Today, there's not. The mainstream doesn't want to hear what we, because I'm not alone, have to say about the dangers of the situation and the alternatives that could be pursued if Trump was supported, at least on the issue of Russia. None of the major mainstream medias, the cable channels, the newspapers, will put us on or publish our views.
Because you're not conforming to the conventional view that's expected from you based on your background.
I mean, it's a belief system. I think it's a kind of cult.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cohen, and good luck with the book. It's a timely subject. You've enlightened me and our listeners today. I appreciate you joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on. All best.
You too. Dr. Stephen Cohen, his new book is War with Russia, ? Quick break, and then we're back with our signature segment, Say What?
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Liberty Nation Radio, syndicated from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. And we want to send out a special welcome this week to the good folks listening on WKAN 101.3 FM and 1320 AM in Kankakee, Illinois, famous for its inclusion in the iconic song City of New Orleans, all about a train ride from Chicago to New Orleans. Thanks for tuning in today.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
Say What, our signature segment featuring some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class as the rolling drama of the showdown over the shutdown unfolded over the run-up to the deadline for a funding deal that would keep the government open over Christmas. There were so many twists and turns that it was almost impossible to keep up with it. Trump's going to shut it down. Then he isn't. Then he is. His supporters were outraged at the thought of Trump refusing to take it to the limit before he had even made a decision. One of his most ardent, high-profile supporters from day one has been drama queen Ann Coulter, who's made a living off of over-the-top commentary on almost everything. And when she was interviewed on a podcast Thursday morning, she was all set to throw Trump overboard.
At this point, it's absolutely clear that one of two things is true. Either Trump absolutely never intended to build a wall. It's just a word. Maybe it was like his safe word. He says it like Shazam. Whenever he's in trouble, he just blurts out the wall. But saying the word is the beginning and end of his interest in it. Or he was elected president and has absolutely no idea how to get it done.
Wow, she did an about-face even faster than she thought Trump was in deciding whether or not to sign a temporary funding bill with no money for the wall that would keep the government completely open over Christmas, and we know how it all ended. Meanwhile, the bulwark for Trump in Congress, the 36-member House Freedom Caucus, sent the message to Trump that if he vetoed the bill, they would have his back. Here's Congressman Mark Walker.
This has been something that's been discussed the entire year. This is something that President Trump made the foremost kingpin foundation of his entire campaign and running for president. I think the time to deliver is now. Republicans, we have to be smart. We also have to have an exit plan of what this looks like long term. We want to make sure government employees are taken care of. But this is a hill that we should be willing to die on.
A hill Republicans should be willing to die on. The wall. There was another big decision that flew under the radar a bit with all the hubbub in the showdown over the shutdown. Seemingly without warning, the president announced that we have defeated ISIS and are therefore pulling U.S. forces out of Syria. And the neoconservative war hawks like Senator Lindsey Graham were not pleased.
Our number one job is to defend America against people who want to attack us. If you're tired of fighting radical Islam, I understand it. They're not tired of fighting you. And if you don't get that, you're making a huge mistake.
And Lindsey Graham's fellow neoconservative Senator Marco Rubio was also sounding the alarm on Trump's decision.
The decision to withdraw an American presence in Syria is a colossal, in my mind, mistake, a grave error that's going to have significant repercussions in the years and months to come.
Well, Trump promised to defeat ISIS and withdraw from Syria during the presidential campaign, and now he has fulfilled both promises. But the neoconservative war hawks never like it when we withdraw troops instead of adding them. He's back. James Comey, the transparently bitter, disgraced former FBI director turned political hack, testified about the FBI investigation, some say whitewash, of Hillary Clinton's email scandal in a closed-door hearing of the House Judiciary Committee for some 6 hours this week, and then used a photo op with reporters to, of course, attack the president who fired him.
So another day of Hillary Clinton's emails and the Steele dossier. This while the President of the United States is lying about the FBI, attacking the FBI, and attacking the rule of law in this country. How does that make any sense at all? Republicans used to understand that the actions of a president matter, the words of a president matter, the rule of law matters, and the truth matters.
So Comey has descended from a once respected law enforcement professional into an angry political partisan who openly urged people to vote for Democrats during the midterm election campaign. And according to James Kallstrom, former assistant FBI director, Comey's a narcissist and an embarrassment to the FBI.
you looked at a picture of someone who was a narcissist, you'd have Jim Comey's. That would be the picture you'd have in the book. He's an educated nimwit. And he promoted people of his ilk around him, I guess, so, he'd feel like he was still going to be the imperial wizard. The guy is just out of his mind. He has zero support now in the FBI.
Democrats blame Comey for costing Hillary Clinton the election by announcing he was reopening the email investigation 11 days before the election. And Republicans blame him for exonerating Hillary months before that and for his self-focused rage after Trump fired him. And he then leaked a memo calling for a special counsel, which he got, of course, in the person of his old pal Robert Mueller. Rare is the man who's managed to get everyone in the D.C. swamp to hate him, but Comey has managed to do exactly that. We close with the acid-tongued lament of one of the Democrat senators who was defeated for re-election in November. Claire McCaskill, defeated in Missouri, pulled no punches in attacking millennial Democrats who are harping at her for not talking enough about her pro-choice position on abortion.
I have been clear about my position. I think the people you talk to are young women who have not spent any time outside of the group of people that agree with them. Shame on them if they don't know my voting record. And shame on them that they're not working as hard as they can for me and not trashing me because of my voting record in a hard state. And they were willing to be critical that I wasn't talking about it enough. Dumb.
Well, as in the case of Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, Republicans who saw the handwriting on the wall and decided not to run for re-election, it's remarkable what losing politicians will say once they're no longer accountable to the voters. We'll take a quick break, then come back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you into the portion of Liberty Nation which we call Talkin' Liberty. Makes sense, doesn't it? As we welcome in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
A week of drama surrounding the showdown on the shutdown, but there was a lot of other things that went on this week.
That's right.
Not the least of which was the sentencing, or lack thereof, of Michael Flynn and the, let me see if I can put it diplomatically, the curious behavior of the judge in the case. He threw out the word treason, said he might have been a traitor to his country after he had said, "You sure you want to stick with your guilty plea?" I can't figure it out. I don't know anybody else who can. Maybe you can.
Judge Emmett Sullivan is the person we're talking about, a federal district court judge, and I don't have an answer for you, Tim. It is bizarre. Perhaps, Judge Sullivan is not a young man. Perhaps he was having a senior moment. It's difficult to.
That's the most logical explanation.
Well, he actually alleged that Flynn committed crimes that the special prosecutor, special counsel himself, had not brought against Flynn.
The prosecutors actually
had to stand up in court and basically tell the judge, yes,
that we didn't even allege
no, Your
this.
Honor, yeah. And the scuttlebutt, by the way, on a couple legal blogs that I pay attention to, is that his clerks basically called him off the bench and gave him, the, hey, you are really screwing up here, and that's what caused him to sort of go back. And then he said, because he had called Flynn, he didn't call him directly a traitor. He said, "You traitorous," I think is what he used. He talked around it, but he used some form of the word traitor more than once to describe Flynn. And no one has discussed, no one has alleged, that Mr. Flynn is a traitor to his country, that he sold us out to someone. It's just a reporting. It's a paperwork crime that he committed.
Right. I've never seen.
Nancy Pelosi doesn't even say that.
I know. I mean, I have never seen, maybe you have, a prosecutor actually defend the defendant he's trying to prosecute to the judge. And the judge throws out the T word, treason, and then comes back later and says, "Well, I was just curious."
Yeah.
What?
And it presents a problem for Mr. Flynn. He has sort of three choices here. and one of them is to withdraw or attempt to withdraw his guilty plea. Now, that plea's already been entered, so the court could allow it to come back, but it's already been entered. I mean, if anybody deserves to see a lenient sentence, you would think it would be somebody who has no record at all, right, who this seems to be an anomaly for, who poses no risk to the community or of reoffending.
And was once a military hero.
Yeah, also that. Yeah, that's a good plug, too.
I mean,
right.
It just makes no sense, but nevertheless, Michael Flynn will spend Christmas, New Year's, 3 more months twisting in the wind.
It's unfortunate. He will not benefit, Tim, from the criminal justice bill that did pass this week. That bill has it's a long way to go for what I think would be a really robust criminal justice reform in this country, but baby steps in the right direction are still movement in the right direction, so that's a good thing.
It's a truly bipartisan bill. I mean, we saw that. We saw the Farm Bill. So in this bitter partisan atmosphere, we've actually seen a couple of bipartisan things happen. You saw a joint press conference with Republicans and Democrats together. When's the last time you saw that?
Well, with Trump and Pelosi in the Oval, but that was a different kind of thing.
That was a different kind of photo op. Bump stocks now banned by the Trump administration. They came to infamy during the Las Vegas massacre several months ago. And the question is, Scott, is this the camel's nose under the tent, the thin end of the wedge to more extensive gun control?
I find this profoundly troubling, Tim. What has happened is that the Trump administration has declared these devices equal a machine gun. And so for the purpose of the law, you now possess a machine gun illegally if you possess one of these devices in 90 days after it's published in the Federal Register. Okay? So 90 days plus a few from now, that's when this regulation will go into effect, and you will be a felon. So if you think about it, there are people who are deployed. Military guys tend to like guns a lot. There are people who are on deployment who won't come home for 90 days. They're felons the day they return back on U.S. soil because they're going to possess a bump stock. I think it is profoundly troubling. I don't see it as the camel's nose under the tent, but it's just one more in another layer of laws, Tim, and this is what so many gun owners reject against. It is the implementation of laws that we know will yield no safety benefit.
Right.
So this is just another thing that takes away. It's like saying for people who like sports cars, well, you can't have a red car. Well, why? Well, because people see red cars speeding. It's like, well, just because the car's red doesn't mean, well, it doesn't matter. We're taking it away. The ATF says that there are between 280,000 and 520,000 possession people these bump stocks in circulation. It is a betrayal of the gun-owning Second Amendment rights people base that so many of whom turned out against Hillary and for Donald Trump in his presidential election.
Yeah, I think it's clear that it's a feel-good measure. It's almost a virtue signaling measure in some sense with absolutely no evidence that it will make any difference, just like attempts to remove guns from law-abiding citizens as the remedy for criminals having guns and committing murders. So it really doesn't make a whole lot more sense than that. Let's talk about the Obamacare ruling. Now, we talked earlier about how it's extraordinary to have, in the Michael Flynn trial, the prosecution stand up and actually correct the judge and defend the defendant they're trying to prosecute. Equally unusual or even weird is that the Trump administration went to a district judge to try to get a ruling on Obamacare to get rid of the individual mandate in law. They didn't expect that judge would rule the entire law, I'm not going to say unconstitutional, but no longer valid because it's been severed from its funding mechanism, which is the individual mandate that requires everybody to pay to be in the program.
Roberts and the court, the majority on the Supreme Court, said this is a valid law because it's a tax.
Right.
It's not a mandate for purchasing. It's simply a tax.
Even though the Congress did not declare it that.
And then the Congress passed a law that stripped it out, so there is no tax. So now what is it? Now it is an impermissible mandate. The judge says we can't have impermissible mandates. The whole thing has to go. I will give him credit, though, by the way. Unlike some Hawaiian and Washington federal judges that are Obama appointees. This judge knows that the appropriate thing to do when you're going to upheave the whole world with your ruling is to stay your ruling so that the Circuit Court of Appeals can weigh in, as surely they will. And that's an appropriate way to make a sweeping ruling. So while it is a sweeping ruling, I salute the judge for the right way to do it. And
but there's no injunction, so it doesn't really effectively change anything until this has been adjudicated all the way up the judicial system. I want to go back to something we discussed last week, and that was the refusal of Brett Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts to hear a case regarding Planned Parenthood. And the original thought was that Kavanaugh was a little weak-kneed because of the whole thing that happened with him, with Christine Ford and the other women during his confirmation hearing. But I heard an alternative view. I don't know if it's possible or not, but the alternative view was that he saw that Roberts was going to side with the 4 liberals, Kavanaugh did, and decided as a preventative that he would vote not to take the case instead of allowing it to come before the court and have a ruling that he didn't find favorable. Do you find that possibility persuasive?
You know, there's a term that we don't hear much used anymore, and it's Kremlinologist. And a Kremlinologist kind of looked at what was going on in the black box of the Soviet Union, and would examine who's in what leadership position, try to determine what the actual what was going on there.
Right.
Supreme Court's a little bit like that. There's very few public statements by the judges about their thinking and what's going on, absent their actual rulings or their published decisions. And again, this denial of certiorari, or a declination to take the case before the court, was not accompanied by a written response by Kavanaugh. So he hasn't let us know what his reasoning is. So the answer to your question is, that's plausible, but it's just a total black box, I think, at this point. We'll only know in the future when we see his jurisprudence on these issues.
Now, my feeling is that Roberts is not much more reliable than Justice Kennedy was. And so this whole big thing about how Kavanaugh would convert the court into a conservative majority, I mean, given that Roberts was the one who enabled Obamacare to survive, and this decision here, along with Kavanaugh, makes me wonder, is John Roberts any more reliable than Anthony Kennedy? Is the court any more conservative, really, than when Kavanaugh replaced Kennedy?
Well, Kavanaugh's only been on the court for how many months now? It's not
but
long.
The question
We're not
isn't about
double digits.
But the question is not about Kavanaugh; it's about Roberts.
But it's about Roberts on the Kavanaugh court.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, Roberts on the Roberts court with Kavanaugh present. Right. And we just won't know until we have more decisions that come out from the court and to see. In fact, I would suggest that even the first year's worth of decisions we won't know. We'll only know when we see some trend lines of where the cases are going. And that's sort of, I think, the more sober way to analyze it. It's not as satisfying as saying this, that, and the other right away. But we just won't know. It's a black box. Until he says why, we don't have an understanding of it, because that's the nature of how the Supreme Court does its business. It's in private and in closed circles until they publish opinions on it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Scott Cosenza there, and this program, Liberty Nation Radio, and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, are available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week. We wish you a merry and healthy and happy Christmas and New Year. We will be back at you next week with another live show. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.